The tension in the gleaming conference room of Sterling Tech Industries was so thick you could cut it with a server blade. 50 of Washington, D.C.'s most brilliant programmers sat frozen like deer in headlights, staring at the impossibly complex algorithm projected on the wall-mounted 85-inch display. The only sounds were the nervous clicking of pens and the occasional gulp of someone trying to swallow their career anxiety. Adrian Sterling, the notoriously ruthless 32-year-old tech mogul, paced behind the glass conference table like a caged panther in his perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit. His emerald eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that had earned him both billions and a reputation as Washington's most eligible and most impossible bachelor. The Washington Post had once described him as devastatingly handsome and devastatingly difficult in equal measure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Adrian announced, his voice carrying that smooth confidence that made stock prices soar and competitors weep. "It's been for hours, for entire hours." He paused dramatically, running his fingers through his perfectly tousled dark hair. "I've seen snails solve Rubik's Cubes faster than this." A nervous chuckle rippled through the room, but it died quickly. When Adrian's gaze swept over them like a spotlight searching for survivors, "Sir," stammered Marcus Chen, the lead developer, adjusting his thick-rimmed glasses, "this algorithm appears to defy the fundamental laws of quantum mechanics. Like asking us to make water flow uphill while juggling flaming torches. Excuses are like bad code." "Marcus," Adrian replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "they're everywhere, and they're all garbage." At the back of the room, near the executive coffee station that costs more than most people's cars, Melanie Parker was trying her best to become invisible. At 29, she'd been working as the night shift cleaner for Sterling Tech for 3 years. Armed with nothing but a high school diploma, an obsolete laptop she'd bought at a pawn shop, and an obsession with coding tutorials on YouTube, Melanie adjusted her navy cleaning smock and tried not to stare at the code on the screen. But it was like trying not to look at a beautiful sunset. Her warm hazel eyes traced the lines of logic, and something clicked in her brain like a key turning in a lock. She'd seen this pattern before, not in any textbook, but in the chaotic beauty of data streams she'd analyzed during her late-night coding sessions. "Impossible," whispered Jennifer Walsh, a Stanford graduate with more degrees than a thermometer. "This would require reshaping the entire framework of recursive algorithms." Melanie bit her lip so hard she tasted copper. She wanted to speak up, but what would happen? The infamous Adrian Sterling would probably have her escorted out by security faster than you could say access denied. Adrian checked his Patek Philippe watch, a gift to himself after his company's IPO, and smiled like a shark who just spotted a school of fish. "Tick-tock. Brilliant minds. You have exactly 10 minutes before I start wondering why I pay you more than some small country's GDP. The panic in the room was palpable. Keyboards clattered like machine guns as desperate programmers threw Hail Mary solutions at their screens. Someone started hyperventilating into a paper bag. Another developer put his head in his hands and began what looked suspiciously like the 5 stages of grief, speedrun edition, but Melanie couldn't take it anymore. Something about the code was calling to her like a siren song, and her feet moved before her brain could stop them. She walked toward the front of the room, her sensible sneakers squeaking on the polished marble floor, each step echoing like gunshots in the sudden silence. 50 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her as if she'd just announced she was secretly a unicorn. Adrian's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "I'm sorry, miss." He paused, clearly having no idea who she was, despite her working in his building for 3 years. "Are you lost? The janitorial supply closet is on the 3rd floor." Melanie felt her cheeks burn like she'd stuck her face in an oven. But something deep inside her, maybe it was courage, maybe it was temporary insanity, made her square her shoulders. "Actually, I think I know how to solve your puzzle." Silence that followed was so complete you could hear a pin drop in the parking garage 6 floors below. Adrian blinked once, twice, then let out a laugh that could have powered a small wind. "Turbine? You? The cleaning lady? You think you can solve what 50 PhD holding, certification, ripping, resume stuffed geniuses cannot?" "Sometimes," Melanie said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. The best way to debug a system is to see it through fresh eyes. And I've been watching everyone make the same mistake for the past 4 hours. She walked to the main terminal with the confidence of someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose, sat down in the leather executive chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and cracked her knuckles like a pianist preparing for Carnegie Hall. "This should be interesting," Adrian murmured, crossing his arms and leaning against the wall with the expression of someone about to watch a spectacular train. Melanie's fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a moment, and then she began to type with the fluid grace of someone who spoke code as fluently as English. The room held its collective breath as lines of elegant solution began appearing on the screen, transforming the impossible puzzle into something beautiful and surprisingly simple, Adrian whispered, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wonder. "I'll be damned." The silence in the Sterling Tech conference room stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Melanie's fingers danced across the keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist, each keystroke echoing in the cathedral quiet space. Lines of code flowed across the massive screen like digital poetry, transforming Adrian's impossible algorithm into something that looked almost elegant. Adrian found himself unconsciously leaning forward, his arms still crossed, but his posture betraying a curiosity that went far beyond professional interest. There was something hypnotic about watching Melanie work, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, how her eyes lit up when she spotted a pattern, the confident tilt of her head as she navigated through layers of complex logic like she was reading a favorite novel. "Fascinating," murmured Dr. Elizabeth Harvard, the company's chief technology officer, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's approaching the quantum entanglement variables from a completely different angle. Like she's thinking in 3 dimensions while we were all stuck in 2. Marcus Chen adjusted his glasses again, squinting at the screen. "Wait, is she actually? No, that's impossible. She's treating the recursive loops like biological neural networks instead of mathematical sequences." "Biological?" Jennifer Walsh leaned forward so far she nearly fell off her chair. "That's either genius or complete madness." "In my experience," Adrian said softly, his emerald eyes never leaving Melanie's profile. The two were often indistinguishable. Melanie's fingers paused for just a moment as she sensed the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on her. She could feel Adrian's gaze like a physical presence, and it made her skin tingle in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Focus, Melanie," she told herself. "You've got this. You've been preparing for this moment your entire life, even if you didn't know it." "The problem," she said aloud, her voice gaining confidence with each word, "is that everyone's been trying to force the algorithm to behave like a traditional computer program. But look at this pattern here." She highlighted a section of code that made the entire display pulse with soft blue light. "It's not digital logic. It's organic. It learns, adapts, evolves. You can't control it. You have to dance with it." Adrian's eyebrows shot up. "Dance with it?" Melanie turned in the chair to face him, and their eyes met for the first time. The impact was like being struck by lightning while standing in an ocean of warm electricity. Adrian felt his breath catch somewhere between his lungs and his throat, while Melanie discovered that her heart had apparently decided to relocate to her ears, where it was beating so loudly she was surprised everyone in the room couldn't hear it. "Imagine," she said, her voice growing stronger, "that you're trying to lead a dance partner who's better than you, smarter than you, and knows steps you've never even heard of. You can't muscle your way through it. You have to listen, respond, anticipate. You have to trust the music." "What's the music in this case?" Adrian asked, taking a step closer. He told himself it was to get a better view of the screen, but the truth was he wanted to see if her eyes really were that incredible. Shade of hazel, or if it was just the lighting. "The data stream itself," Melanie replied, turning back to the keyboard. "Every input, every variable, every seemingly random fluctuation. It's all part of a larger symphony. You just have to know how to listen." Her fingers flew across the keys again, and suddenly the impossible algorithm began to sing. Numbers cascaded across the screen in perfect harmony. Variables aligned like stars in a constellation, and the recursive loops started spinning in synchronized circles that looked less Like code and more like digital ballet. Holy silicon, breathed Marcus, his face pressed so close to his monitor that his glasses fogged up. It's actually working. The quantum processors are running at 300% efficiency. That's not just impossible, that's magnificently impossible. Dr. Harvard was furiously scribbling notes on her tablet, muttering formulas under her breath like incantations. The processing speed has increased exponentially. We're looking at computational power that shouldn't exist for another decade. Adrian moved closer, close enough that Melanie could smell his cologne. Something expensive and intoxicating that made her thoughts scatter like startled birds. "How did you know?" he asked quietly. His voice meant only for her ears. "I didn't," she admitted, her hand still flying over the keyboard as she fine-tuned the final parameters. "I just felt it. Sometimes the best solutions come from intuition, not intellect." "Intuition," Adrian repeated, as if tasting the word. "I've built an empire on logic, strategy, and ruthless calculation. I don't believe in intuition." Melanie glanced up at him, her hazel eyes sparkling with a challenge. "Maybe that's your problem." The algorithm completed with a soft chime that sounded like church bells on a Sunday morning. The room erupted in applause, but Adrian and Melanie might as well have been alone on a desert island. The air between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with quantum mechanics and everything to do with something far more dangerous. "Congratulations," Miss Adrian paused, realizing he still didn't know her name. "Parker. Melanie Parker. Miss Parker. You've just solved a problem that was supposed to take my team 6 months in 20 minutes. He straightened his tie, a gesture that Melanie was learning meant he was thinking fast. "I believe this calls for a celebration. Dinner tonight?" The room had gone quiet again, every programmer straining to hear her answer. The weight of their attention, combined with Adrian's intense gaze, made Melanie feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. "I don't think that's appropriate, Mr. Sterling. I'm just the cleaning lady, remember?" Adrian's smile was slow and devastating. "After what you just did, Miss Parker, you're anything but just anything." 8 o'clock. La Bernardine. I'll send a car." He turned to address the room, but his eyes never left hers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've found our new head of quantum development." The applause that followed was thunderous, but all Melanie could hear was the sound of her world changing forever. The black Mercedes pulled up to Melanie's rundown apartment building at exactly 7:45 p.m., drawing stares from neighbors who'd never seen anything fancier than a pizza delivery car on their street. Melanie sat on her fire escape, still wearing her cleaning uniform because it was the nicest thing she owned, watching the sleek vehicle idle below like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong galaxy. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Your chariot awaits." As Adrian Sterling had somehow gotten her personal number, which should have been impossible since she'd never given it to him. But then again, she was learning that very little was impossible for Adrian Sterling. She climbed down the rusty fire escape, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The driver, a professional-looking man in a crisp uniform, opened the door without a word. The interior of the car smelled like leather and money, two scents that Melanie had never experienced together. La Bernardine rose before her like a temple to culinary perfection, all glass and gleaming surfaces that reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. Melanie had walked past this restaurant 1,000 times on her way to work, but she'd never imagined she'd step foot inside. The Mater D took one look at her uniform, and his expression shifted from welcoming to confused. "I'm here to meet Adrian Sterling," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's entire demeanor changed instantly. "Of course, Miss Parker. Right this way." The restaurant was a symphony of soft conversations, clinking crystal, and the subtle sounds of culinary artistry. Every table held people who looked like they belonged in magazines, discussing deals that probably involved more money than Melanie had ever seen. She felt like an alien who'd accidentally wandered into a different species' natural habitat. Adrian sat at a corner table that offered both privacy and a view of the entire restaurant. He'd changed from his business suit into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her rent. When he saw her approaching, he stood. and Melanie noticed several women at nearby tables turn to watch him with undisguised hunger. "You came," he said, pulling out her chair with old-fashioned courtesy that seemed natural rather than performative. "I wasn't sure I would," Melanie admitted, settling into the chair that was more comfortable than her bed. "This isn't exactly my usual scene. What is your usual scene?" She gestured at her uniform. "Cleaning office buildings at night, eating ramen noodles for dinner, falling asleep to coding tutorials on YouTube?" Adrian poured wine from a bottle that had been waiting at the table, something French with a name she couldn't pronounce. "Tell me about the coding tutorials. You really want to know?" "I wouldn't have asked if I didn't." So she told him. About the second-hand laptop. About the nights she'd spent teaching herself programming languages while the rest of the world slept. About the data visualization projects she'd worked on just for fun, creating digital art from garbage datasets. About the dreams she'd harbored but never spoken aloud. Dreams of building something beautiful and functional and entirely her own. Adrian listened with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the room, in the city, in the world. His emerald eyes never left her face, and when she paused to sip the wine that tasted like liquid starlight, he leaned forward slightly, waiting for her to continue. "Why didn't you ever apply for a position at Sterling Tech?" asked when she'd finished. "Have you seen the job requirements? Masters in computer science, 5 years of experience, proficiency in programming languages I'd never even heard of. I'm a high school dropout who learned to code from free videos. Yet you solved a problem that stumped my entire development team. That was different." She struggled to find the words. That was like hearing a song in a language I didn't know, but understanding the melody anyway. Adrian set down his wine glass and studied her with an expression she couldn't read. "I have a proposition for you, Melanie Parker." The way he said her name made her skin tingle. "What kind of proposition?" "I want to offer you the position of head of quantum development. Full salary, benefits, stock options. You'll have your own team, unlimited resources, and the freedom to pursue any project that interests you." Melanie nearly choked on her wine. "You want to give me a job I'm not qualified for based on one lucky guess?" "It wasn't luck, and we both know it." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his businessman persona sliding into place like armor. "But there's a catch." Of course there was. "What kind of catch?" "The board will never approve this appointment. They'll see your lack of formal credentials and vote it down before I can finish the proposal. So we'll need to be creative." "Creative how?" Adrian's smile was the kind that had probably launched 1,000 corporate takeovers. "We announce our engagement tomorrow. You become my fiancé, which gives you social credibility and access to the company. You'll attend board meetings, company events, get to know the key players. After 6 months, when you've proven yourself indispensable, we'll announce the promotion. Then, after a respectable period, we'll have a quiet breakup. No harm, no foul." The restaurant seemed to spin around Melanie like a carousel that had jumped its tracks. "You want me to pretend to be engaged to you? It's a business arrangement. Clean, simple, mutually beneficial. You get the career you've always dreamed of, and I get the most brilliant programmer I've ever encountered. And what happens if people find out it's fake?" "They won't. We'll be convincing." Melanie set down her fork, her appetite completely gone. "You're asking me to lie to everyone, to pretend to love you for money. I'm asking you to be smart. This is how the world works, Melanie. It's not fair, but it's reality. Your talent deserves recognition, but the system won't give it to you based on merit alone. So we game the system." She stared at him across the table, this beautiful, dangerous man who was offering her everything she'd ever wanted in exchange for something she'd never imagined giving up. "What if I say no? Then you go back to cleaning offices, and the world loses out on whatever miracles you might have created." It was emotional blackmail, pure and simple. But as Melanie looked into Adrian's emerald eyes, she realized that somewhere between the algorithm and the wine, somewhere between his proposition and her heartbeat, she'd stopped caring about the ND, ethics of his offer, and started caring about the man making it. 6 months? She asked quietly. 6 months? And then we part ways? No strings attached? No strings attached? Melanie took a deep breath, tasting possibility and danger in equal measure. I'll need it in writing. Adrian's smile was triumphant and somehow sad at the same time. Of course, my lawyers will draw up the contract tomorrow. He raised his wine glass in a toast to the most beautiful lie ever told. As Melanie clinked her glass against his, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was either making the best decision of her life or signing her own emotional death warrant. Possibly both. 3 months into their arrangement, Melanie had learned that pretending to love Adrian Sterling was far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Not because it was difficult, but because it was becoming far too easy. She stood in the mirror of his penthouse bathroom, adjusting the emerald necklace he'd insisted she wear to tonight's charity gala. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the night shift cleaner she'd been 6 months ago. Designer dress, professional makeup, hairstyled by someone whose hourly rate exceeded her former weekly salary. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. They held a light that hadn't been there before, a confidence that came from being valued for her mind rather than just tolerated for her service. "You're stunning," Adrian said from the doorway, his voice carrying that familiar mixture of admiration and something deeper that he'd never quite acknowledged. "Thank you." She turned to face him, noting how his black tuxedo made his emerald eyes even more intense. "Ready for another performance?" The word stung, and she saw him flinch slightly. Over the past months, their performances had begun to feel less like acting and more like glimpses of something real. The way he brought her coffee in the morning without being asked, how he listened to her ideas about quantum processing with genuine fascination. The moment last week when she'd fallen asleep on his shoulder during a long flight to a conference, and he'd sat perfectly still for 3 hours, rather than wake her. "Melanie," he began, but she cut him off. "We should go. Your board members don't like to be kept waiting." The Sterling Foundation's annual gala was held at the Kennedy Center, a glittering affair where Washington's elite gathered to write generous checks and congratulate themselves on their philanthropy. Melanie had attended 3 of these events now, and she'd learned to navigate the social currents with increasing skill. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she could sense Adrian's tension in the way he held her hand just a little too tightly. The way his smile seemed forced when greeting colleagues who'd become familiar faces over the past months. "Adrian, darling." Victoria Ashworth. The steel magnolia, who served as chairwoman of Sterling Tech's board, glided toward them with the predatory grace of a shark in Chanel. And the lovely Melanie. "My dear, you look absolutely radiant." "Thank you, Mrs. Ashworth. You look beautiful." As always, Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "I've been meaning to ask, dear. I was speaking with Margaret Pemberton yesterday. You know her? Her daughter went to school with you. She couldn't quite place your family name. Parker, was it? From which Parkers do you descend?" Melanie felt the trap closing around her with mechanical precision. Victoria Ashworth hadn't become one of the most powerful women in Washington by accident. She'd done her research, and she knew exactly what she was asking. "I'm afraid we're not one of the prominent families," Melanie said carefully. "My father worked in construction." "How refreshingly honest," Victoria purred. "And your mother?" "Died when I was 16. The silence that followed was loaded with everything Victoria hadn't said. Adrian's hand tightened on Melanie's waist, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "I'm sorry for your loss," Victoria said, though her tone suggested she was anything but. "It's so admirable how you've risen above your circumstances. Though I must say, Adrian, your choice is certainly unconventional." "Melanie is the most remarkable woman I've ever met," Adrian said, his voice carrying a warning that Victoria chose to ignore. "Oh, I'm sure she is. Though I couldn't help but notice that there's been no formal announcement of a wedding date. Why, surely after 6 months?" "We're taking our time," Melanie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "When you know it's forever?" "There's no need to rush." Victoria's laugh was like breaking crystal. "How romantic. Though in my experience, dear, when a man truly wants to marry a woman, wild horses couldn't keep him from the altar." The barb hit its mark. Melanie felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of Victoria's words sank in. Around them, Other conversations seemed to pause as the social equivalent of a car crash unfolded in real time. "If you'll excuse us," Adrian said coldly, "I need to speak with the senator." He guided Melanie away from Victoria's triumphant smile, but the damage was done. The doubt that had been growing in Melanie's heart over the past weeks suddenly bloomed into full-blown certainty. This was all a lie. She was living a lie. And everyone knew it. They made it through the rest of the evening with practiced professionalism, but the ride home was conducted in suffocating silence. It wasn't until they were back in Adrian's penthouse, surrounded by the artifacts of their shared deception, that Melanie finally spoke. "She knows." Adrian loosened his tie with sharp, frustrated movements. "Victoria Ashworth is a bitter woman who makes sport of tearing down anyone she perceives as beneath her station. That doesn't make her wrong." Melanie kicked off her heels, the expensive shoes clattering across the marble floor. 6 months, Adrian. You said 6 months, and then I'd be established enough to stand on my own. But it's not working, is it? They still see me as the cleaning lady who got above herself. That's not true, isn't it? She turned to face him, her carefully arranged hair beginning to fall from its pins. Your board barely tolerates me. Half your investors think I'm a gold digger, the other half think I'm your midlife crisis made manifest. Adrian ran his hands through his hair, destroying the perfect styling that had taken his valet 20 minutes to achieve. But I do. The words exploded from her with more force than she'd intended. I care because every day I pretend to be something I'm not. Every day I lie to people who are starting to feel like friends. Every day I watch you lie to protect me, and I hate myself a little more. So what are you saying? Melanie looked around the penthouse that had become her prison of silk and lies. At the quantum processing lab he'd built for her in the basement. At the life she'd built that was entirely dependent on maintaining a fiction. I'm saying that. I can't do this anymore. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Dora. Adrian stared at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something raw and desperate that made her chest ache. Duh. The contract specifies 6 months, he said quietly. Sue me, she laughed, but there was no humor in it. Take me to court for breach of contract. Explain to a judge how you hired your fake fiancé to fool your board of directors. I'm sure that will go over well with the SEC. Adrian flinched as if she'd slapped him. Is that really what you think this has been? Just a contract? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the moments they'd shared. All the glances that had lasted too long. All the almost kisses that had been interrupted by the demands of their charade. What else could it be? Melanie whispered, hating herself for asking, hating him for making her care enough to need an answer. Adrian stared at her for a long moment, his emerald eyes holding emotion she couldn't name. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're right. It's just a contract. It's always been just a contract. The lie hit her harder than any truth could have, because she could see in his eyes that it was a lie, and she could see that he was telling it to protect them both from something that had grown far beyond their control. I'll be out by tomorrow, she said, turning toward the stairs that led to the guest room that had become her sanctuary. Melanie. She paused without turning around, afraid that if she looked at him, she'd lose her resolve entirely. For what? It's worth, Adrian said, his voice rough with emotions he'd never learned to express. You were never just anything to me. Melanie closed her eyes, memorizing the sound of his voice saying her name one last time. Then she walked upstairs too, packed the remnants of her beautiful lie. 6 weeks after Melanie walked out of Adrian Sterling's life, she was debugging code in a coffee shop in Georgetown when her laptop screen flickered and died. The second-hand machine had finally given up, taking with it 3 weeks of work on a freelance project that would have paid her rent for the next 2 months. She sat staring at the black screen, fighting back tears of frustration. Since leaving Sterling Tech, she'd been living off her savings while trying to build an independent consulting business. It was slow going. Potential clients saw her lack of formal credentials and moved on to safer choices. Had made her briefly famous was now just a story she told to explain why she didn't have references. Excuse me, are you Melanie Parker? She looked up to find a young woman in a Stanford sweatshirt standing beside her table, clutching a laptop. covered in programming stickers. Yes, I'm Sarah Chen Marcus's daughter, the one who works at Sterling Tech. You told me about what you did with the quantum algorithm. I'm a computer science major, and I've been following your work. She paused, looking nervous. Would you mind if I asked you something? Sure. How did you know? How did you see the pattern that nobody else could see? Melanie studied the earnest young face before her, remembering herself at that age, hungry for knowledge and validation in equal measure. I stopped trying to make it behave the way I thought it should behave, and started listening to what it was trying to tell me. Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding, like debugging legacy code. Sometimes you have to work with the system instead of against it. Exactly. Sarah hesitated, then forged ahead with the boldness of youth. Would you maybe want to grab coffee sometime? I mean proper coffee, not whatever they're serving here. I have so many questions about adaptive algorithms. Before Melanie could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me at the Jefferson Memorial, please. As her heart stopped, then started again with a rhythm that felt dangerously like hope. I'd love to, she told Sarah, scribbling her number on a napkin. Call me next week. 20 minutes later, Melanie stood at the base of the Jefferson Memorial, watching Adrian pace in front of the marble steps like he was preparing for battle. He looked different, thinner, tired in a way that expensive suits couldn't hide. He saw her approaching. He stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, as if sudden movement might cause her to disappear. You came, he said, the same words he'd spoken that first night at La Bernardine. I almost didn't. I know. He looked out over the tidal basin, where cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom in defiant splashes of pink against the gray march. Sky, I have something to tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago. Adrian the board fired me. The words hit her like a physical blow. What? 3 days after you left, Victoria Ashworth called an emergency meeting. She presented evidence of our arrangement. The contract you signed, photos of us together, testimony from staff members who'd noticed that we never seemed quite authentic. He laughed bitterly. Apparently our performances weren't as convincing as we thought, but that's impossible. The contract had confidentiality clauses. My lawyers betrayed me. Victoria offered them more money than I was paying them, and they handed over everything. Adrian turned to face her, his emerald eyes holding a pain that made her chest ache. The board voted unanimously to remove me as CEO. They said I'd compromised the company's integrity. Melanie stared at him in horror. Adrian, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't walked out? No. His voice was sharp with conviction. This is entirely my fault. I created this situation. I asked you to lie for me, and when the lies became too much for you to bear, I let you walk away thinking that none of it mattered to me. The wind off the Potomac was cold, but Melanie barely felt it. What are you saying? I'm saying that somewhere between the algorithm and the charity galas, somewhere between the fake engagement and the very real conversations we had at 3 in the morning, I fell in love with you. The words came out raw and unpolished, nothing like his usual smooth confidence. I fell in love with your brilliant mind and your terrible jokes and the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. I fell in love with how you made me want to be better than I am. Tears blurred Melanie's vision. Adrian, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I hurt you by lying about my feelings when you were brave enough to ask for the truth. Need you to know that every moment of joy I felt during those 6 months was real. Every time I watched you solve an impossible problem or light up talking about data visualization or fall asleep reading technical manuals, I was falling deeper. In love with you? Why didn't you tell me? Because I was terrified. Adrian's voice broke slightly. I've spent my entire adult life believing that relationships were just another form of business transaction. Love was a weakness that could be exploited. When I realized what was happening to me, I panicked. I told myself it was just the arrangement, just proximity and good acting. But when you walked away, when I watched you pack your things and leave without looking back, I knew I'd lost the only thing that had ever really mattered to me. Melanie wiped away tears with the back of her hand. You broke my heart, Adrian. I was falling in love with you too, and you made me feel like a fool for it. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting that. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I want to make things right, or at least try to. What is that? The paperwork to establish Parker Quantum Solutions. Your own company, fully funded. With contracts from 3 major tech firms who've been following your work since the algorithm breakthrough. You'll be completely independent, answerable to no one but yourself. Melanie stared at the envelope like, it might explode. I can't accept this. It's not charity. It's an investment. Those contracts are real. The clients want your expertise specifically. And the funding comes with the expectation of significant returns. Adrian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his green eyes.
You're brilliant.
Melanie, you deserve to have the world recognize that brilliance without having to pretend to be someone you're not. And what about you? What happens now? Adrian's smile was sad but genuine. I'm starting over. I've got enough personal savings to launch a small consulting firm. Nothing flashy, just me and the skills I actually possess rather than the empire I inherited. He paused, studying her face like he was memorizing it. I'm learning to be the kind of man who deserves someone like you. The cherry blossoms drifted around them like snow, and Melanie found herself thinking about algorithms and data streams, about patterns that only made sense when you stopped trying to force them into predetermined shapes. There's something you should know, she said quietly. I've been working on something. It's a new approach to quantum computing based on the principles we discovered together. It's revolutionary, but I need a partner. Someone who understands both the technical aspects and the business side. Adrian's eyes widened. Are you offering me a job, Miss Parker? I'm offering you a partnership, Mr. Sterling. Equal shares. Equal. Say in all decisions, but there would be conditions. Name them, no more lies. No more arrangements or contracts or pretending to be anything other than what we are. If we do this, we do it honestly. And what are we, Melanie? She looked at him standing there in the shadow of Jefferson's memorial. This brilliant, flawed, beautiful man who had taught her that sometimes the greatest courage lay in admitting you were wrong. We're 2 people who are better together than apart. We're a woman who sees patterns in chaos, and a man who can turn those patterns into reality. Where she paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. We're 2 people who love each other enough to build something real instead of just pretending to have something perfect. Adrian closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, cupping her face in his hands like she was made of something precious and fragile. Is this real? He whispered. As real as quantum entanglement. As real as code that dances instead of calculating. As real as falling in love with someone while pretending not to. When he kissed her, it tasted like truth and possibility and the promise of algorithms yet to be solved. Around them, the cherry blossoms continued their silent dance. And Melanie realized that sometimes the most beautiful solutions were the ones you never saw coming. 6 months later, Parker Sterling Quantum Solutions announced their first major breakthrough, a processing system that adapted and evolved in real time, learning from its environment like a living thing. The press called it revolutionary. The scientific community called it impossible. Melanie and Adrian called it dancing with the data. On their wedding day, as they stood in the same spot where Adrian had offered her his heart along with his apology, Melanie whispered in his ear, "No contracts this time." "No contracts," he agreed, sliding the ring onto her finger. "Just us and whatever patterns we create together." As they kissed beneath the blooming cherry trees, their story became part of the larger algorithm of the universe. 2 variables that had found their perfect recursive loop, solving for love in the most elegant way possible. The end.